Major problems tonight at General Motors that, in a worst-case scenario, could shut down all of its North American plants, including Lordstown.
For more than a century, General Motors has been treated as a symbol of industrial permanence. Wars, recessions, oil shocks, financial crises, GM survived them all. So when headlines begin stacking up about shutdowns, pauses and withdrawals across multiple continents, it raises a much more uncomfortable question. Is this just restructuring, or is something deeper breaking down? Over the past few years, GM has quietly closed technology centers, engineering hubs, manufacturing plants, and battery facilities, not in one country, not in one division, but across its entire global footprint. Thousands of workers have been affected. Entire communities have felt the shockwaves. And yet much of this has been explained away with corporate language like realignment, flexibility, and long-term strategy. But when you step back and look at the pattern, it becomes harder to ignore what's happening. These aren't random cuts. They're hitting core systems, software, engineering, production, and electrification, the very pillars GM says will define its future. At the same time, demand forecasts are softening, international competition is intensifying, and the costs of transformation are climbing faster than expected. The real concern isn't that GM is changing. Every automaker is. The concern is how many of GM's so-called future-proof assets are being shut down, paused, or abandoned at the same time. If these moves are defensive rather than strategic, the consequences extend far beyond one company. They affect workers, suppliers, cities, and even the broader North American economy. Tonight, we're breaking down what's really happening behind GM's recent shutdowns, starting not on the factory floor, but inside the digital infrastructure that was supposed to power the next generation of vehicles. Because the first major crack didn't appear in manufacturing, it appeared in GM's software backbone. Real quick, if you're into videos that cut through the noise and break things down clearly, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more people find this. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time. We've got more deep dives coming your way. Also, drop a comment and let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your take. Now onto the video. The General Motors Information Technology Innovation Center in Georgia was never meant to be expendable. When it was launched, the facility was positioned as a cornerstone of GM's transformation into a software-defined automaker. This wasn't a support office or a temporary experiment. It was designed to house hundreds of specialists working on cybersecurity, systems integration, internal platforms, and digital tools that touched nearly every business unit inside the company. For years, GM leadership emphasized that the future of vehicles would depend less on horsepower and more on code. Over-the-air updates, centralized data systems, diagnostics, and software-driven architectures were framed as essential to staying competitive against Tesla and rapidly advancing global rivals. The Georgia Center embodied that vision. It was placed in a growing technology corridor, recruited highly skilled workers, and became part of GM's public narrative about investing in long-term innovation. That's why the announcement of its shutdown in late 2025 landed so hard. On the surface, the company described the move as part of a broader consolidation effort, a way to streamline operations, reduce duplication, and align resources with shifting priorities. But internally, the closure sent a very different message. If a facility so closely tied to GM's digital future could be cut, no asset was truly safe. Employees described the decision as abrupt and deeply unsettling. Many had relocated from other states, believing GM's repeated assurances that in-house software development was a long-term commitment. Some had just completed multi-year projects aimed at improving internal coordination between engineering, manufacturing, and logistics teams. When the center closed, those efforts were frozen or redistributed, and confidence in the company's direction fractured almost overnight. The shutdown also exposed a contradiction in GM's strategy. For years, leadership argued that spreading innovation centers across multiple states would keep the company agile and competitive. But as costs rose and electrification demanded massive capital investment, that decentralization became harder to justify. Maintaining several digital hubs meant overlapping teams, duplicated systems, and rising overhead, all at a time when margins were tightening. Consolidation may have made financial sense on paper, but cutting the Georgia center revealed how quickly GM was willing to retreat from its earlier promises. The impact didn't stop at GM's balance sheet. Local businesses felt the loss immediately as foot traffic dropped. Community leaders worried the closure would damage the region's reputation as an emerging tech hub. What had once been a symbol of an industrial giant embracing the digital age became a cautionary tale about how fast corporate priorities can shift under pressure. Most importantly, The Georgia shutdown set a precedent. It showed that even the digital systems meant to carry GM into the future could be sacrificed in the name of survival. And that raised a much bigger question. If GM was willing to cut its software backbone, what would happen when physical infrastructure started to fail? For decades, the Coal Engineering Center in Warren, Michigan, stood as one of General Motors' most stable and respected institutions. It wasn't just another office complex. It was a technical nerve center where engineers, designers, analysts, and testing teams worked side by side to solve the hardest problems in vehicle development. From early-stage concepts to advanced validation, much of GM's engineering DNA passed through that building. For many inside the company, the center symbolized continuity, proof that while strategies and products might change, GM's engineering foundation remained solid. That perception shattered in September 2025, when the facility was abruptly shut down following the diagnosis of Legionnaire's disease in 2 employees. Out of caution, GM closed the entire building to investigate potential contamination in the water and ventilation systems. While officials initially described the move as temporary, the closure immediately triggered deeper concern across the organization. This wasn't a marginal facility experiencing a minor disruption. It was a flagship engineering hub being taken offline without warning. The health incident became more than a safety issue. It exposed uncomfortable questions about infrastructure oversight. Employees began asking how a site of this importance could suffer such a basic failure. Legionnaire's disease is typically linked to poorly maintained water systems, and the fact that it appeared in such a critical building raised fears that long-term maintenance may have been deprioritized amid years of cost-cutting and restructuring. The shutdown forced many to confront a troubling possibility that financial and strategic pressures had slowly eroded even the most fundamental safeguards. Operational consequences followed immediately. Teams reliant on specialized labs, testing rigs, and simulation rooms suddenly lost access to essential tools. Some employees were moved to temporary spaces, while others were pushed into remote work despite the highly collaborative nature of their roles. Projects tied to tight timelines were delayed, reassigned, or paused altogether. This disruption came at a particularly dangerous moment, as GM was already juggling the transition from internal combustion platforms to complex, software-heavy electric architectures. Beyond logistics, the emotional impact ran deep. Veteran engineers who had spent decades inside the Coal Engineering Center described a sense of loss that went beyond inconvenience. The building held memories of past breakthroughs, major launches, and professional milestones. For younger staff, the shutdown shattered the assumption that certain pillars of GM's ecosystem were untouchable. If an engineering stronghold with decades of history could be forced offline so suddenly, what else might be more fragile than it appeared? Externally, the closure drew attention from industry observers and local leaders alike. Questions emerged about GM's preparedness to manage environmental risks during a period of massive organizational change. The episode didn't just interrupt work, it undermined confidence, and it reinforced a growing realization. GM's restructuring wasn't only about trimming excess, it was beginning to expose vulnerabilities at the core of the company's operational confidence. While attention in the United States remained focused on engineering disruptions, General Motors was making another move that would send shockwaves far beyond its North American operations. In April 2024, GM abruptly withdrew from manufacturing operations in Colombia and Ecuador, ending more than 4 decades of industrial presence across the 2 countries. The decision didn't unfold gradually. It arrived suddenly, leaving workers, suppliers, and local governments scrambling to respond. For generations, GM's facilities in Colombia and Ecuador had provided stable employment and economic anchor points for entire regions. These plants didn't just assemble vehicles, they supported supply chains, funded community development, and created long-term pathways for education and technical training. Families built their lives around the assumption that these operations were permanent. GM framed the exits as part of a broader global strategy focused on next-generation vehicles, electrification, and manufacturing consolidation. The company argued that concentrating production in fewer, more technologically advanced facilities would improve competitiveness in an increasingly unforgiving market. But in Latin America, that explanation rang hollow. Analysts pointed out that these closures reflected deeper pressures, shrinking margins, intensifying competition from Asian automakers, and the financial strain of sustaining smaller regional plants while pouring capital into electric vehicle development elsewhere. In Colombia, the shutdown carried particular weight. GM had operated in the country for over 40 years, becoming a symbol of industrial partnership and stability. Thousands of direct and indirect jobs vanished, Suppliers that depended on predictable orders faced immediate crisis. Local businesses saw traffic dry up. Community leaders warned that replacing such a large industrial employer would take years, if it happened at all. Ecuador experienced similar disruption, though the effects played out differently. The GM plant had served as a stabilizing force within the country's industrial sector. Its closure triggered urgent government efforts to provide retraining and support for displaced workers. Many suppliers, once secured by long-term contracts, found themselves confronting potential permanent closure. Economists described the exit as a severe blow to confidence in foreign manufacturing commitments. The broader implications extended beyond national borders. GM's withdrawal forced policymakers across Latin America to re-evaluate their reliance on multinational corporations for long-term development. Labor groups cited the closures as evidence that workers remain vulnerable when strategic decisions are made thousands of miles away. The message was clear and unsettling. Even decades of presence do not guarantee permanence when global strategies shift. If GM's exits from Colombia and Ecuador signaled retreat from smaller markets, the closure of its Shenyang plant in China told a far more alarming story. China was supposed to be the crown jewel of GM's global expansion. For years, executives believed that success in China wasn't optional, it was essential. The Shenyang facility, equipped with modern production lines and advanced tooling, stood as a symbol of that ambition. But by early 2025, the reality inside China's automotive market had changed dramatically. Domestic manufacturers surged ahead, producing electric vehicles that matched or surpassed international competitors in performance, technology, and price. These companies moved faster, adapted more quickly, and tailored their designs precisely to local preferences. GM, constrained by global decision-making structures and legacy platforms, struggled to keep up. Sales softened, dealership influence declined, brand loyalty weakened. Despite attempts to respond through targeted product launches and marketing adjustments, GM couldn't reverse the momentum. The Shenyang plant became increasingly underutilized, its capacity outpacing demand. Maintaining operations no longer made financial sense. When the closure was announced, it sent a chilling message across the global auto industry. Analysts described the move as both pragmatic and symbolic. Practically, it reduced losses in an increasingly hostile market. Symbolically, it marked the end of an era in which Western automakers assumed dominance in China was inevitable. The rise of domestic EV brands reshaped the competitive landscape, favoring speed, software integration, and aggressive pricing, areas where multinational firms often lag. For employees and surrounding communities, the shutdown carried heavy consequences. Skilled workers lost stable employment. Local businesses felt immediate economic decline, and international investors were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. China was no longer a guaranteed engine of growth for global automakers. More broadly, the Shenyang closure raised fundamental questions about GM's global footing. If the company could no longer justify operating in the world's largest automotive market, its entire strategy required re-evaluation. And as foreign markets weakened, pressure was building back home, particularly around the facilities meant to secure GM's electric future. If General Motors' earlier shutdowns raised concerns, the pause at its Ultium battery plant struck at something even more sensitive: the company's future. The Ultium facilities in Ohio and Tennessee were not legacy assets inherited from the past. They were built specifically to power GM's electric transformation. From the moment they were announced, these plants were framed as non-negotiable pillars of the company's long-term survival in an electric world. The Ultium platform was supposed to solve several problems at once. It would anchor domestic battery production, reduce reliance on foreign supply chains, and give GM the flexibility to scale electric vehicle production across multiple brands. Early projections suggested these plants would operate at high utilization for years, feeding a growing lineup of electric trucks, SUVs, and crossovers. For a time, that narrative held. Jobs were created, construction moved quickly, and GM positioned itself as a leader in US-based battery manufacturing. Then, in January 2026, GM announced that operations at both plants would be paused to implement upgrades aimed at increasing flexibility. The explanation sounded measured, but the timing raised eyebrows. Pauses at facilities this early in their life cycle suggested deeper structural challenges. Analysts quickly pointed to slower than expected EV adoption, which left GM with more battery capacity than near-term demand required. At the same time, battery technology itself was evolving rapidly, forcing manufacturers to rethink chemistry, packaging, and production methods sooner than planned. Financial pressure compounded the issue. Battery plants demand enormous upfront investment, and volatile prices for lithium, nickel, and other materials strained cost projections. Pausing production allowed GM to limit operating expenses while engineers reworked systems to adapt to shifting market conditions. But it also disrupted assembly plants across the US and Canada that depended on a steady supply of Ultium cells. Production schedules were adjusted, workers reassigned, and suppliers left navigating uncertainty. Critics saw the pause as evidence that GM's electrification strategy was built on overly optimistic forecasts. Supporters argued that early adjustments would make the system stronger long-term. Regardless of interpretation, one reality became unavoidable. Even the facilities designed to secure GM's future were no longer immune to disruption, and that forced the industry to ask whether GM's transformation was under tighter control or slipping further into uncertainty. Viewed in isolation, each of GM's shutdowns and pauses can be explained. A technology center consolidated. An engineering hub closed for safety reasons. Manufacturing exited from smaller markets. A Chinese plant shuttered under competitive pressure. Battery facilities paused for upgrades. But when these events are placed side by side, a pattern emerges that's impossible to ignore. The cuts aren't limited to one geography or one function. They strike software, engineering, manufacturing, and electrification, the very systems GM needs to compete in the next decade. What's unfolding isn't a single misstep, but strategic overload. GM is attempting to execute multiple transformations at once, while defending shrinking margins, navigating global competition, and absorbing massive capital costs. Electrification alone is a monumental challenge. Layering software reinvention, global consolidation, and supply chain restructuring on top of it magnifies the risk. This pattern also reveals a shift in corporate priorities. Long-term commitments are becoming conditional. Regional loyalty is secondary to financial flexibility. Assets once described as essential are now negotiable. For workers and communities, this reality is unsettling. Stability, once a defining feature of legacy automakers, industry observers increasingly view GM as a case study rather than an exception. Other automakers face similar pressures, but GM's size means its decisions ripple outward, affecting suppliers, labor markets, and regional economies. The company's restructuring highlights a harsh truth of the modern auto industry. Scale no longer guarantees resilience. In some cases, it makes adaptation slower and more painful. The unanswered question is whether GM's consolidation will restore stability, or whether it will shrink the company's capacity to innovate just when competition is most intense. Because when foundational systems are repeatedly disrupted, confidence becomes as fragile as infrastructure, and that fragility sets the stage for what comes next. What's happening at General Motors is bigger than a series of closures. It's a turning point that reflects how dramatically the automotive world has changed. For generations, GM represented industrial permanence. Today, it represents transition, uncertain, expensive, and unforgiving. The shutdowns of software centers, engineering hubs, manufacturing plants, and battery facilities reveal a company under extraordinary pressure to adapt faster than its own structure comfortably allows. GM isn't collapsing, but it is being forced to make decisions that would have been unthinkable just a decade ago. And those decisions carry consequences far beyond corporate earnings reports. For workers, the message is sobering. Careers once built on the assumption of long-term stability now exist in a landscape defined by flexibility and risk. For communities, the loss of major facilities reshapes local economies and erodes trust in multinational commitments. For consumers, the turbulence raises questions about pricing, availability, and the pace of innovation in the vehicles they'll buy next. At the same time, GM's struggle offers insight into the future of the entire industry. Electrification, software integration, and global competition are rewriting the rules. Companies that move too slowly risk irrelevance. Those that move too fast risk destabilizing their own foundations. GM is walking that line in real time, and the outcome remains uncertain. Whether these restructurings ultimately strengthen the company or expose deeper vulnerabilities will become clearer in the years ahead. What's already clear is this: the era when industrial giants could rely on momentum alone is over. The changes unfolding inside General Motors aren't just about survival. They're a preview of how fragile even the largest players can become in a rapidly evolving global economy. Once again, thanks for watching this video. If you got something out of this, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. And hey, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Agree, disagree, or something in between. I'd love to hear it.